without further ado, I'm going to introduce Piers Riley-Smith. Piers, I suppose as an opener, can you just provide us with a brief overview about enabling the legal position around enabling development?
Of course, thank you, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everyone. So I think the starting point is what is enabling development generally as a concept? And I think a fair sort of summary of it is it's where development that would otherwise be considered unacceptable in local or national policy terms is considered acceptable because it would facilitate, or in other words, enable benefits that would outweigh that harm. And do note the importance, the focus on that the development would otherwise be unacceptable. This isn't just a case where an acceptable development is cross-funding another part of that development. That's not quite enabling development. In relation to heritage, therefore, the benefit we're really mostly looking at is how the development would produce funds which can be used to pay for repairs or preservation of a heritage asset. I think probably the most usual circumstances where in the large grounds of a crumbling country house, you might have a housing development promoted. To give a very brief potted legal history of it, I think most would say you can root the concept of enabling development back in the case of Monaghan, which was decided in October 1989. It's better known as the Royal Opera House case. That was where the council had granted outline planning permission, mainly for significant reconstruction and modernisation of the Royal Opera House, but also commercial development on the same site in the offices. And the offices would have been contrary to the local plan or the local policy at the time and the Covent Garden Action Area Plan, but the council said their view was the commercial elements of the scheme were the only way to fund the modernisation of the Royal Opera House. That went all the way to the Court of Appeal about whether that was lawful, whether that funding was a material consideration. And the Court of Appeal found it was, in particularly enjoyable words. They said that financial constraints on the economic viability of a proposal were unavoidable facts of life in an imperfect world. So it was a material consideration to consider the finances. But a point to note from that very early first case was that those different elements of development were all part of one proposal and were all part of the same site. So the court in that case, back in 1989, stressed the importance of the close proximity between the enabling development and what it was actually enabling. But that doesn't, frankly, answer the question entirely about whether for enabling development, there not just needs to be a functional separation, but also a physical separation. That's a bit of a grey area, and we could spend a very scintillating webinar talking about whether that's the case or not, whether you need physical proximity and temporal proximity. I think in short, the answer is not necessarily. You don't necessarily need to have something right next to a heritage asset, or you don't need to be putting in applications for your planning permission and listed building consent at the same time necessarily. There was a similar case around the same time about mining that suggested that wasn't the case. But those will be important elements, and they are, of course, reflected in the guidance and policy, which we're going to come on to talk about. There are probably just a few other points I want to highlight at this stage, because actually, in terms of looking at case law compared to policy, I would say that the development of the concept of enabling development in relation to heritage has come forward more through policy and guidance documents than it has through case law. But a few points to highlight. First of all, when we're looking at enabling development in terms of heritage, the harm that is being overcome by the benefit doesn't necessarily have to be heritage harm. It could, for example, be as well greenbelt harm. So there's a case called ISAQ, I-S-A-Q, which talked about how looking at things in a holistic way, it could be greenbelt policies about very special circumstances that could also be relevant to this enabling development point. The second point to come out of case law, I think it's worth mentioning, is the status, well, of what is now the Historic England guidance, what was then at the time of the case of Young, the English Heritage guidance back in 1999. Interestingly, the Court of Appeal, when looking at the status of this guidance, and it is non-statutory, found that it was essential for considerations of enabling development. so that would seemingly place the guidance on a very strong footing, although I think it's worth noting, and this may be a point we come back to, that case in 2002, I think it was about 8 years before we saw the first national government policy on enabling development, which came forward in Planning Policy Statement 5 in March 2010 in Policy HE11. If I've got that wrong, I'm sure Gail will correct me on that. The third point to note, just from this potted legal history, and it's a concept I think it's important to flag right at the start, is conservation deficit. To have enabling development, it's going to be important to show that there is a conservation deficit. In short, that's where the cost of repair would outweigh the market value of the heritage asset post-repair. And that's going to be important to understand for many reasons, but partly because enabling development must be demonstrated to be the minimum necessary to secure the future of the asset. And perhaps the final point I'll end on in relation to the setting out the scope of enabling development is, of course, it should be the last resort. And there's going to be a need for evidence to be produced to support that conclusion.
Thanks, Piers. You mentioned PPS 5. That seems many, in 2010 to me sounds only like it was only yesterday, but to other people it may seem an awfully long time ago. But so that did have policies in it in relation to enabling development. What's the MPPF position? So
the MPPF position now, no points to any of the attendees who can point to the two places, by my count, where enabling development in relation to heritage is mentioned. Paragraph 79, subsection B, talks about it in relation to the development of isolated homes in the countryside. Talks about how decisions and policies should avoid that unless B is the development would represent the optimal viable use of a heritage asset or would be appropriate enabling development to secure the future of the heritage asset. That's in relation to isolated homes. The main, if I can call it that, policy in the MPPF on it is paragraph 202, and I will read that out in full just because it is, of course, central. It's repeated in the guidance. You'll see it all over the place. That local planning authorities should assess whether the benefits of a proposal for enabling development, which would otherwise conflict with planning policies, but which would secure the future conservation of a heritage asset, outweigh the disbenefits of departing from those policies.
Right. Much help from the PPG about enabling development?
Not hugely, frankly. I mean, I think the best you'll find is at paragraph 15 of the Planning Practice Guidance on the Historic Environment, which talks about, in particular, the meaning of this phrase that I mentioned in relation to isolated homes, optimal viable use, or OVU. It's connected to, and again, all of these things sort of play into each other, but it's connected to, but I wouldn't say is identical to enabling development. Enabling development is often more about taking the funds from something and using those funds to carry out repairs to a heritage asset. Optimal viable use is about turning the heritage asset into a use that will, as it were, be able to sustain it going long into the future. And what is an optimal viable use? Well, if there are multiple economically viable uses to turn this old country house into a hotel or a spa, if there are multiple ones of those, which of those uses is going to cause the least harm to the significance of the asset, not just through those initial changes, but also as a result of the subsequent use and wear and tear? It is that use that will be the optimal viable use. That's what the PPG helps with. I'm not sure it's hugely helpful on other things, but of course that's where the guidance we're talking about today comes in.
That was a beautiful segue. Thank you very much, Piers. I'm going to now canter through the guidance itself. It won't take as long to go through the key points as it would have taken to go through the 2008 guidance, which was about 3 or 4 times as long in terms of page numbers as the 2020 guidance. The linchpin, I think, as Piers has already mentioned, is that there must be a conservation deficit. If there isn't, there's no point in bothering going forward with an enabling development proposal. But what the guidance helpfully does do is lays out 7 steps which are expected to be taken before enabling development is seen as being a legitimate way forward. The 7 steps don't necessarily need to be carried out consecutively. They could be carried out at the same time. They could be mixed and matched. But the important message right from the very beginning, the guidance tells us loud and clear, is that the evidence underpinning an enabling development proposal needs to be clear and convincing. The reason it needs to be clear and convincing is, as the guidance says many times throughout the document, enabling development is an exception to planning policy. So, I mean, some people might think that it's a series of barriers being put in the way of enabling development, but it permeates, I think, from the starting point, that paragraph 202 of the framework, which indicates that enabling development is very much an exception to policy. That's why you need to have strong evidence. So the various steps are as follows. Step 1 is a condition survey. I mean, that essentially speaks for itself. You assess with an expert surveyor what the condition of the heritage asset in question is. It can be done by itself or as part of a broader conservation and management plan, which, for example, some large country estates might have. The next step is the assessment of alternatives. So it may well be that there are other solutions to conserve or enhance the heritage asset in question, and it will be expected that you demonstrate, if you're applying for enabling development planning permission, that you've examined and hopefully exhausted other sources of income, whether that's public money, whether that's charitable sources of income, whether that's grants. In terms of grants, I mean, I came across quite an interesting case, and we'll need to be slightly careful here, the brilliantly named Hamsterley Hall in County Durham. It was the ancestral home of the 19th century author R.S. Surtees, who was famed for his depictions of fox hunting characters, and in particular Jorrocks, the sporting grocer and master of foxhounds. So there's enabling development. There have been 2 appeals in relation to Hamsterley Hall, both unsuccessful, but in the first one, Historic England had refused to consider grant funding because they thought there was a real possibility of enabling development being able to fund the restoration works. The inspector in that case said that, well, that's not a reason for withholding a grant in those circumstances. So make sure, I think, is the clear message that you have examined every single possible source of alternative funding. Ask yourself the question, can you bring forward an optimal viable use, as Piers mentioned already, that doesn't involve enabling development? Could you sell it? Could you sell it to somebody else who's able to fund the restoration works? And what the guidance does expect in the context of looking for different ownerships is that you have properly market tested alternatives. And it's recommended in the guidance that this exercise is lengthy, is detailed, and it exhorts both parties, local authorities and applicants, to be patient and painstaking. So it's an indication that local authorities may well expect a lengthy and wide-ranging marketing exercise to make sure that all alternatives have been explored and reasonably discounted. And in fact, it also chimes with a point that's made later on in the guidance, that in some cases it might actually be preferable to mothball the project and to maintain the heritage asset in as best a way as you possibly can without restoration, particularly in difficult market conditions. As Piers mentioned, quite often residential development is the form of enabling development that is put forward. But in difficult market conditions where values are relatively low, the chances of you having to promote more houses in order to make up the conservation deficit is higher. So one of the things that the Historic England does bear in mind, not only the patient and painstaking marketing exercise, it also indicates that in some cases, if you're going to have to promote an awful lot of enabling development in a difficult market, that might point to mothballing the proposal. I just have 2 further points on the alternatives on step 2, which is assessment of alternative solutions. One is that in some circumstances, it might be appropriate for the local authority to discount a private sale as an alternative solution. The reason for that is that particularly in the case of those heritage assets that have a very significant public value, perhaps a very large country house that is full of very interesting artifacts. In those sorts of cases, a private sale might lead to the artifacts, furniture within the building, dare I say, perhaps urns on the top of gateposts, might end up going to a different owner. So a private sale in those circumstances where there's a real risk of the fragmentation of artifacts connected to the heritage asset itself, private sale might be discounted. The final point on this, on step 2, is that you can't cherry pick parts of the estate. You can't identify, say, well, that particular part of our holdings is especially unviable or difficult, or we can't bring it forward, and use just that fragment of the estate as a justification for enabling development. The guidance is quite clear. If you have larger land holdings or the heritage asset is part of a wider estate, it's the whole estate values, the market value of the entire estate that you need to take into account. The theory being that if you have an estate which is operating viably as a whole, then that should be used to fund the restoration or conservation works in relation to other parts of the estate that aren't. So that's step 2. Step 3, you assess the cost of the repairs and future maintenance. The interesting point here is the guidance stresses that the repairs and enhancements shouldn't be an ideal world of repair or enhancement. So when you're assessing what repairs are necessary, it's not the absolute best you could possibly make it. It's a balance. And the balance requires you to take into account a number of things, to focus on the works that will contribute best to the long-term viable use of the heritage asset. And also interestingly, and that's perhaps quite oddly, the section which explains how step 3 operates invites decision makers and applicants to assess the development costs such as affordable housing or community infrastructure levy contributions, which suggests that there's, in deciding what repairs to go forward with, some sort of mini preliminary planning balance ought to be undertaken to decide what repairs are necessary. I mean, my own view really is that it might be preferable to assess the best case scenario as one of the options, and then you, in recognition of the fact you might need to amend or draw back from some of the repairs if the enabling development to deliver them is actually very significant, is going to tip the balance against the grant of planning permission. So that's step 3. Step 4, you assess the market value in the current condition of the heritage asset and in its repaired condition. And as we've heard already, where the current value plus the repair costs exceed the value when the works are completed, there is a conservation deficit. I mean, to be honest, this market valuations are something that's very complex. They're sensitive to different inputs. You might get a different view from a different valuer, and it may well actually be the subject of a future, no doubt very entertaining webinar about assessing viability and value. But some of the key messages just to draw out of the step 4, this market value and current repair condition, is that you should expressly exclude certain items, such as the owner's inability to fund a viable scheme. That's not seen as being something that's relevant to assessing the current market and future market values. So it's ownership blind in that sense. On the other hand, ownership blindness also means that simply because there's a particularly well-heeled owner doesn't necessarily mean that enabling development is not appropriate and isn't acceptable. The other point to note under assessing market value is that an unrealistic purchase price or valuation that doesn't reflect the actual market position or doesn't recognise the planning restrictions that apply to a designated heritage asset, they are to be discounted when you're considering what the future market, the current and future market values are going to be, and therefore to calculate the conservation deficit. If you've done a bad deal, unfortunately, that's not something that's going to feature in a strong enabling development case. So that's step 4. Step 5 is you work up your detailed design for your preferred option. In other words, what is the enabling development going to be and what is it going to look like? It's seen in the guidance, this design stage, as being a separate but linked exercise. Clearly, one of the things one must look at when designing a preferred option is to minimise, where at all possible, the impact of the proposed development on the heritage asset. Piers has mentioned the Northumberland County Council case from 1989, which talks about development in a different area, enabling proposals in a separate location. One thing, again, this probably applies more to larger estates than it does to other types of heritage assets, but it would make absolute sense if you're going to promote an enabling development proposal to site it in a location on your estate or your land holdings that has the lowest effect on the heritage asset you're seeking to restore. So step 5. Step 6 is a development appraisal to show how the enabling development will contribute to the conservation of the heritage assets. What the guidance suggests is that you have 2 development appraisals. The first one is you calculate the conservation deficit. So in other words, how much money do you need the enabling development to generate in order to bring the heritage asset into a state where its future viability and its significance are going to be maintained. So that's the first one. The second one is to calculate the minimum amount of enabling development that is necessary to meet to bridge the conservation deficit or bridge the conservation gap. Now that's, again, another clear message from the guidance is that you should not be promoting any more enabling development than is absolutely necessary to bridge the conservation deficit. Again, a last resort point that we've spoken about quite a few times already. And if that wasn't enough, the guidance also suggests that you as an applicant should seek to offer to fund an independent audit of your development appraisals. Not suggest your own guy does it, but a local authority, most local authorities, when they're examining development appraisals, whether it's for enabling development or not, will have it independently audited, and that's a cost that Historic England suggests should be borne by the developer. As was other key messages from the development appraisal section, it needs to be open book. So particularly, let's say, for example, quite a few developers enter into and landowners enter into overage agreements. If there is an overage agreement, that needs to be disclosed to the local planning authority so they can assess the impact that has on the conservation deficit and the amount of enabling development. The guidance is also relatively flexible on profit margin. So developers' profit is seen as a case-by-case matter to consider. Slightly different from the PPG guidance on viability generally, which suggests that there is a range, it's a 15 to 20% range for developers' profits in almost all cases. But the Historic England guidance is slightly different. I think it must recognise that for some developers, a lower level of developers' profit would be sufficient to encourage them to have a go at this particular development. So you've got through stages 1 to 6, you're now at stage 7, you're on the home straight, local authorities on board. This all sounds dead easy. You come up with a delivery plan. So the delivery plan, in my experience, the delivery plan is often enshrined in a Section 106 obligation. And in the enabling development cases that I've been involved in, it's often taken as long to negotiate and draft the terms of a Section 106 obligation to deliver the benefits of enabling development as it took to get to that point in the first place. So some of the tools which could be included in a Section 106 agreement, which the guidance refers to, is to have phasing arrangements so that you don't have the enabling development coming forward more quickly than the works to the heritage asset itself. You could have performance bonds, so the developer has to meet certain targets, particularly in relation to renovating the heritage asset. Most local authorities, supported by Historic England, would want to have step-in rights. So if 150 houses are built and nothing's been done to the crumbling country house, with a security, with a surety or a bond and step-in rights, the local authority has within the Section 106 the opportunity to carry out the works funded by a bond or a surety. All of those things come with a cost, and what the guidance recognises that if a local authority is asking for a significant amount of money to underpin the possibility that the works won't be carried out, that in and of itself is an additional cost, which might in and of itself lead to a further need for enabling development. And it advises that decision makers strike a balance between the possibility of non-compliance and the cost to the applicant, that developer, of entering into these sort of fairly onerous arrangements. The other thing, which is particularly important, I think will inevitably be necessary, either by way of conditional Section 106 obligation, is that it's no good to grant permission for enabling development in order to renovate, restore a heritage asset, only to let the heritage asset fall into rack and ruin in due course. So a long-term maintenance plan or management plan or conservation management plan, they're called various different things, I think is almost always going to be essential. So I'm going to take a deep breath now. That was a bit of a gallop through the different stages in the guidance. And now I think I'm going to turn to Gail with this first question. Gail, what works well in the new guidance?
Well, there are certainly a few things that do work really well in the new guidance. It's slimmed down, but it is clearly articulated and set out. So somebody approaching enabling development often does so with a lot of caution, and reasonably so. This guidance will leave them under no illusion as to the task ahead of them and the size of it, but it does set out clearly the steps that they need to go through. And, you know, not least of which, it gives a really clear relationship with the MPPF, set out via, you know, really signposting back to paragraph 202 of the MPPF. And the 2008 guidance had, of course, been completely out of date in that respect for some time. So that's another thing. In terms of setting things out clearly, Historic England do provide a flowchart with it, which isn't actually within the guidance, but is on their website as well, which goes through those stages that you set out, Jonathan, which I've sort of slightly annotated. It is 7 no's and a yes, or 7 big red crosses and 1 tick. But really, you know, that's a good thing. Get it out there up front. Make sure that nobody is undertaking this lightly. And I think that is very clearly reflected in the wording of the guidance too. But the really big thing that works well is the relaxation of the material harm test that was in the previous draft of the guidance. So the previous policy given at the beginning of the 2008 guidance stated that enabling development should be unacceptable unless it will not materially harm the heritage values of the place or setting. A bit double negative, but essentially you can't do any harm under the previous guidance. And this was a huge stumbling block, and the new guidance recognises very clearly that you may need to do some heritage harm in order to get your enabling development away and to bring forward the overall really big heritage benefit that you're looking for. The way the previous guidance stated that you should not materially harm the heritage values. Well, what is material harm? It's anything big enough to be considered. So that covers a massive range of harm that could take place. The example that's given in the new guidance as harm that might occur is placing development in the setting of a listed building and causing harm through change to setting. So the new guidance allows for that to happen, and that has to be useful. But material harm could also be loss of fabric that's vital to the conversion of a building to optimum viable use. So that's important to make sure that that shouldn't stand in the way of enabling development either. And it may even be change to elements of fabric that make access safe to a building. So it's really basic stuff. So allowing material harm as long as you meet the key policy tests. And the new guidance does contain some really very sensible breaks on this, which are again clearly articulated. So first and foremost, the new guidance requires that any harm has clear and convincing justification and relates back to paragraph 202 of the MPPF, as noted before. But there's also the concept of the tipping point that's set out in paragraph 19. Too much harm proposed by any enabling development, and it may be preferable to accept the risk of further decay that comes with that development not taking place at all. And that's got to be a sensible approach to take. If you're proposing too much harm, not only will it be unacceptable, but you're not going to have the heritage significance there long term. And there's also a good mention later on in paragraph 42, which, not unrelated to this, deters speculative reconstruction. So you shouldn't be using enabling development to speculatively reconstruct turrets on your castle. I don't think anybody wants to Disneyfy anything as part of the process. One of the things that works well, which is something that Jonathan mentioned earlier, is the removal of the typical ranges of profit which were given in the previous draft of the guidance. They gave some typical ranges, and the guidance stated that profit should normally be within the range indicated. It wasn't hard and fast, but it certainly suggested that it really should be, very reasonable. No range is given in the new guidance, and this could increase flexibility, especially as the new guidance recognises that riskier ventures might need the added incentive of higher profits in order to get somebody to undertake the work. You only have to look at grand designs to see that anything involving historic buildings is another recipe for budgets being hit by unforeseen circumstances. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to make sure that you're attracting developers to this type of development by allowing them to have a reasonable level of profit as a result. I did wonder if this might be something that LPAs could use against schemes that they are not in favour of. Without the range, perhaps saying, using it as a mechanism to say, this is unacceptable because you are requiring too much profit. But to be completely honest, if you're going into enabling development and you don't have backing of the LPA in Historic England, you are on one hell of a tough gig to start with. It's not that it couldn't conceivably happen, but it absolutely stands the best chance of going forward when the LPA in Historic England are on board with it.
That's a really good point, Gail. It might explain why, if you do a search for appeal decisions involving enabling development, A, there aren't an awful lot, yeah. And B, those that there are tend to be unsuccessful. It may indicate that enabling development, as you just said, is the sort of thing that you need to be on board with the local planning authority, and an appeal is going to be quite a difficult sell. But I went through the various steps, and they are, I think, less numerous and less detailed perhaps than the previous set of guidance. But are there any sort of real key things, if you're going to go forward with an enabling development scheme, what as a developer are you, or indeed a local planning authority, what are the sort of key things you need to be aware of?
I think if you're coming forward as a developer, and I think we've had one question as we've been on this about this particular thing, you shouldn't really see enabling development as something to get development away in a greenfield site, to get any, say, residential development away in a particular location. Enabling development is very, very specific to the asset to solve specific problems that that asset has. The guidance is really clear, really asset focused. And indeed, it says that it's to solve a specific problem with an asset, to solve the needs of a place rather, not an owner. So it's really clear, very much focused on the heritage asset itself, not on a developer, absolutely, you know, very clear on that, and not on the owner either. And I think we had another question about ownership and length of it. It's, unfortunately, it is not to solve the problems of a particular owner. The other concept, you know, you've mentioned it already. The guidance is clear that it's got to be a last resort, and that you have to go through all of the other possibilities of solving the problem, which you mentioned, you know, preventative measures, grant funding, transfer of ownership, sympathetic development, and compulsory purchase and enforcement. Although that's a bit of a moot point, whether there's an appetite from a lot of local planning authorities, and reasonably so, for the expenditure involved to go for compulsory purchase is a different matter. And finally, just the thing to be aware of, which is again something that you've mentioned, it's having the really clear and transparent evidence base and making sure that you're not stinting on providing that. Certainly the proposals that I've been involved in the past, the ones that have stood the best chance have been the ones that have taken the time to collate the information and make sure it's rock solid, both proving that it's the last resort and also proving that you're only coming forward with the minimum amount of development required in order to solve the conservation deficit.
Brilliant. I'm going to ask you to stick your neck out here, Gail. And anything that could be improved?
I think it could be a bit more positive. I mean, the last thing I'm suggesting is that the guidance gives an unrealistic portrayal of success. And I don't think anybody could accuse it of that at the moment. But there are things that could be encouraging without being unrealistically positive. And the main thing would be to provide some case studies of where it's happened in the past. Okay, it won't be under the guidance, of course it won't, because it's new guidance, but any case studies are helpful because these projects are always going to be complicated. Any information that can be shared about what went well previously and what didn't go well previously, but just giving an idea of, you know, what stands the best chance of success would be really positive. Maybe that's something that Historic England is going to be sharing in the future, but that would certainly be really useful. I think it's, I think a few solid case studies, definitely.
Yeah, and when we were discussing this in preparation, one of the things, I didn't pick this up, and maybe because most of the stuff that I look at doesn't have pictures, but then I went back and had a look to see that actually an awful lot of the Historic England guidance has really useful, helpful pictures to explain the point they're making. There's one photograph, isn't there, on the front, on the first page of this guidance?
Yes, and it doesn't say where it is. It says repairs underway, but doesn't give a location. I mean, Historic England have a library of the most wonderful photographs. My favourite ever being the one on the old setting guidance of Ferrybridge Power Station with the church in front of it, which is unfortunately lost from the current guidance. But yeah, maybe they're saving paper, maybe they're thinking of the environment, Jonathan. But it would be good to have some pictures.
May well, but it's entirely possible, I suppose, that somebody attending this webinar might actually know where that photograph was taken.
Well, points for prizes.
Yeah, they do. They do. Brilliant. The other thing, I suppose the final question I've got for you, Gail, before we turn to questions from our audience, is, I mean, you're obviously familiar with the previous 2008 guidance, if you compare that previous guidance with the most recently issued HECPAP, is the new document going to make it easier, harder, make no difference to obtain permission for enabling development? What's your judgment?
My judgment is it's got to make it easier. The removal of the material harm test has got to be a really positive thing. However, the new guidance is still really clear that, well, it still uses the phrase last resort, and obviously makes it very clear that it shouldn't be entered into lightly. But I think the big thing, as I mentioned earlier, is outside of the new guidance, the two things that bring the greatest chance of obtaining planning permission have to be early dialogue with the LPA in Historic England and obtaining their support for a project. Perhaps maybe if an asset is on the at-risk register, then maybe you're kind of quite a long way down the line in your argument in terms of, you know, very, very strong need for something, although obviously you still have to document why all the other avenues have been discounted. And the other thing that stands you in the best chance of obtaining planning permission has got to be meticulously compiling your evidence base and making sure that you have undertaken marketing and the discounting of other options and documenting and presenting that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Piers, I think you've been keeping an eye on the questions as they've been coming in.
Yes, I have. The switchboards have been lighting up, as it were. John, perhaps I'll start with you with this question, which is, I think it's important just because it is such a central concept. We've been asked again to explain what the concept or definition of a conservation deficit is. I was wondering whether maybe you could just set that out.
Well, I will read out.
I thought you might, yeah.
I will read out from page 3 of the guidance where the conservation deficit is defined. So the conservation deficit is the amount by which the cost of repair and conversion to optimum viable use, if appropriate. Pausing there for a second. So repair is obviously keeping the heritage asset in the use it is currently or formerly was in. Optimum viable use might be, as Piers said earlier on, the change from a large country house to a luxury hotel and spa. If that is going to be the best option to maintain the significance and the condition of the heritage asset going forward. So it's the amount by which the cost of repair of or optimum viable use of a heritage asset exceeds its market value on completion of repair and conversion, allowing for all appropriate development costs. So put in really simple terms, you ask yourself the question, well, how much is it going to cost? What's the market value of the asset at the moment? And in some cases, it's probably going to be at or close to zero. How much is it going to cost us to renovate, restore, conserve this heritage asset? And the difference between after and how much will it be worth post-repair? The difference between those figures is the conservation deficit, and that gives you a figure to put forward to the local planning authority to say, well, there's a conservation deficit, for example, of £3.5 million. In order to fund a £3.5 million conservation deficit, this is the sort of development and this is the quantum of development that we're going to need to bridge that gap.
Thank you. Gail, I might ask you next, and perhaps we've mentioned there a few terms, the optimal viable use and enabling development, and just understanding that and the relationship between them. Say if we've got a hypothetical rundown country house, Easton Manor has fallen into disrepair, and there's
a very good condition, Piers. I look after it very well.
Yes, it also has full planning permission and listed building consent for all of its alterations.
Yeah.
Easton Manor, or Riley Smith Manor, if it makes it less controversial.
That sounds better, actually.
We could either save it through having 50 homes as enabling development built somewhere in the grounds, or we could turn it into the Riley Smith Hotel. which do we choose? Because of course we're told enabling development is meant to be a last resort, but putting 50 homes far away might cause less harm than turning it into a hotel.
I think it's got a, the standard heritage answer is it's always on a case-by-case basis. You know, is it something that's, you know, lots of country houses have had really mixed uses, especially over the 20th century, war uses, use of schools, conversion back to houses. Is it something that could actually be readily appreciated? Could its heritage significance be readily appreciated and understood and indeed accessed by more people as a hotel? It would also relate to whether it was originally built. You know, I suppose it's a question of what's going to better reveal and allow the appreciation of its significance. It may be that conversion to a hotel is completely compatible with its heritage significance. However, it may be, the Riley Smiths may be a very long historic family. It may be a medieval manor house, and it may be that in order to convert it to hotel bedrooms with ensuite facilities, you need to start whacking doorways all the way through it. In which case, you may well be in the realms of 50 houses at some distance away being far preferable. But of course, it's got to be remembered that the preference of the Dowager Duchess Riley Smith has got to, you know, unfortunately isn't a consideration. So there's, as ever with heritage, case by case, what's going to better reveal its heritage significance overall when you've been through a long and very detailed consideration of it.
And of course, for some heritage assets, or, you know, or scheduled ancient monuments, there's going to be no optimal viable use, because, you know, if the Stonehenge being turned into a spa isn't going to help it there or add to its heritage significance in any way. So there's some things where there is no optimal viable use.
Absolutely, and that goes to speculative reconstruction as well, which this guidance definitely deters. You know, you shouldn't be trying to rebuild things into things that you can't be confident that they were. Otherwise, you're obscuring the heritage significance of it through layers which shouldn't be there. So yeah, absolutely. If you're looking at something that has no use, that no optimum viable use that's compatible with its heritage significance, then it is going to be repair, consolidation, perhaps something that encourages public access to appreciate and understand it. And definitely your 50 houses in an obscure corner of the estate.
I think with an eye on the time, potentially just we have time for just a few more questions. And Jonathan, perhaps, I don't know whether you can assist with this, which is the questions come in about whether the new guidance provides any reasonable support for site allocations and plan making, or is it strictly looking at development and asset focused?
I think I can give a fairly swift answer to that. No, it doesn't give any guidance on plan making. I think for the very simple reason that the enabling development is an exception to development plan policies. And I don't recall that actually many local plans, if any, having specific policies in relation to enabling development in the context of a heritage asset. So other, because it is an exception, because it is a last resort, I think it'd be highly unusual for a local authority specifically to allocate a site as enabling development. I mean, in the broader sense, I suppose if you were promoting a site for allocation for housing, for example, for a local plan, you could explain as part of your promotion exercise that some of the money generated by constructing the houses could go towards regenerating, repairing the heritage asset, but it is development management specific, is my reading of it.
And I think we've had a flurry of late questions, but of course we will emphasise, if we've not had time to answer them today, we will try and do a written note briefly outlining some of them. But perhaps I'll choose this as the final question and put it to Gail, which is, if an owner's paid for a heritage asset at auction, is that taken into account in the conservation deficit? So what they've actually paid for it at auction?
Well, the guidance is really clear. It has paragraph 49 onwards relates to site value and is entitled "Has Too Much Been Paid?" So it states enabling development is tested against the needs of the place, not the owner. It's not in the public interest to permit enabling development simply on the basis that too high a purchase price having been paid for the heritage asset. So I'm not quite sure from the question whether it's asking if more has been paid at auction, can that be taken into account? Well, unfortunately, no. If too much has been paid, and unfortunately it is the actual value and the comparison of that to get the conservation deficits. So unfortunately not. Apologies if I've misunderstood the question on that one.
Right, well, I mean, there are a few questions looking to delve into that grey area about physical separation and how the distance you need between them. I think we'll probably have to leave that for the written note, because I think there's quite a lot to be said. Thank you for all your questions. I will now hand over to Jonathan to close the webinar.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Piers. Excellent questions. And really good, like you said, we are going to go through the questions and provide a short note, and hopefully in a few days' time to answer the points. I'm quite happy to deal with this anonymous question though. That was great. Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. That's very kind of you. We're coming. That was a pretty quick run through the guidance. I think it does bear some detailed reading. If you've got any questions that crop up after the webinar finishes, I think you should fairly easily be able to find our respective email addresses. And I know that I certainly won't mind dealing with any points that you might have after the webinar. I see nods from my fellow panelists, so thank you, you too. Final thing I need to say is thank you very much to Piers, and a particular thanks to Gail for giving up her time and explaining so very clearly the impact from her point of view of the new guidance. And it just leaves me now simply to say thank you very much for attending. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and hope to see you in a webinar sometime soon somewhere else. Thank you very much. I'll close the webinar.